quickly.
Well, order, and welcome to this afternoon's Treasury Committee evidence session, a part of your ongoing scrutiny in Parliament. Can I start by asking you to introduce yourselves for the record, Mr. Alder?
Alder, Chair of the Board of the FCA.
Thank you. Mr. Rathi.
Good afternoon. My name is Nikhil, Rathi, Chief Executive of the FCA, and this is the first hearing since the announcement. Many congratulations on your date, Chair.
Oh, gosh, yes. I keep yeah. Thank you. Mr. Alder, I wanted to start with you, really, because you'll have seen the level of industry backlash, ministerial backlash, House of Lords backlash to the recent enforcement consultation. And as chair of the FCA, were you expecting that level of reaction when the board signed off on that consultation?
Yeah. Can I take a step back on this, and really from a board perspective back to the beginning, and then we can get on to the reaction to this. I think it's important to step back because, of course, as you'd expect, the board looked at the consultation before it was issued. And broadly, it felt that the rationale underlying the consultation was suitable for consultation, and the rationale is set out in the consultation itself. But the risk of repeating what it's saying, but I think it's important. What we were looking at were factors to do with deterrence. We were looking at factors to do with whistleblowing. We are looking more broadly at the whistleblowing framework to ensure that it is more effective going forwards. And we were looking at factors such as the potential or the reality of speculation and rumour around cases and how that then plays into overall public confidence. And we're also aware that there had been, over a fairly long period, a number of asks, including from this committee, around particular cases, what's happening in relation to a matter of public concern which involves enforcement. So that was the sort of envelope which we looked at. I think in terms of the reaction to it, I think I think we weren't at the time we put this out expecting such a kind of stern reaction as has come from industry.
What would your board minutes say about the discussion around this?
As I've summarised, that it was suitable for consultation. Okay. And I think what is really, really important is that for the reasons I've just gone through, I think also what's important is that no decision has been made. Yeah, so there is no decision to reverse.
It's a consultation, I understand that. And, the special advisors to our subcommittee, when they were talking to our subcommittee about it, I mean, one of the words they used was bonkers. And, you used to work in Hong Kong. You understand how different jurisdictions deal with these kinds of things. Can you give me an example of where there is a jurisdiction that takes this approach?
Not this exact approach. I think there are jurisdictions that vary around how there are variations as to when and how they announce investigations, whether it's the outset of an investigation or part through. There are examples, and I think we can come back to you on this, of regulators, again, from a broad, and this is important, we were talking about, the consultation talks about a shift from exceptional circumstances, which basically means hardly ever, to a public interest test. And so regulators elsewhere do look at public interest. So, for example, I think Australia has a public interest test in similar circumstances. There is, certainly in the feedback that we've got to date, there are questions have been raised about, okay, it's a public interest test. Where is the bar set when we're judging public interest if this goes forwards? So yes, it varies. I don't believe that there's a a proposal which is exactly like this. As I say, we felt as a board that there was an underlying rationale that made sense to consult on, and it was against the background of a history of asks which are basically positioning those asks or requests from a public interest perspective, and how we react to that.
Given that it was only last year that the FCA was given this secondary objective of international competitiveness, I think it strikes all of us that this is one of the first acts that you consult on since you were given that secondary objective, because it's not something that you've mentioned Australia, but it's not something that other major competitive jurisdictions would do. I mean, the US wouldn't do it, the Swiss wouldn't do it, I don't think the French would take this approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, look, firstly, this is around an activity or an operational aspect, a very important operational aspect of what the FCA does and other regulators do, which is absolutely core to underpinning public confidence in the financial system, which is enforcement, which is supervision, which is our gateway. I think it's, so far as the competitiveness objective is concerned, there is a view that ensuring that that core operational work is as strong as appropriate is really important to and fundamental to competitiveness. And I think there's a sort of narrative that's developing which I think sort of ignores to an extent much of the work that this organisation, the FCA, has been doing, is continuing to do, which is absolutely fundamental to practical concerns around competitiveness. So I'm referring to things on the sort of supply side of life, equity capital markets, listing rules, intermittent trading venue, and I could go on. There's a long list. And on the demand side of life, the work we're doing around help gap, which effectively one of the results of that, or one of the intended consequences, is mobilising domestic savings for productive investment into UK enterprise. Ditto the work around pensions. So there's a lot of really, really important practical work that we're doing around, which I personally believe falls firmly under the heading of competitiveness, because it has practical consequences as to how savings are mobilised around investment, particularly into UK enterprise. That's the kind of feeling around it. This, my frank view, is that going back to the board meeting that we held when this consultation paper was discussed, is that it is legitimate, given often the expectations on the FCA as to what we may be expected to say when, for example, there is speculation and rumour about a situation and we're investigating. I think it was valid to go out with a consultation around what we might do, not necessarily at the outset of an investigation, it could be, or partway through an investigation, in naming. And I should say also that it's really, really clear that this is not, there's no presumption to disclose or to name. And that's quite clear. So at the moment, so there's no presumption to do so. So as we develop this, as we discuss it, as we take on board the feedback, we'll have to start thinking, or we will start thinking about what criteria would be applied or should be applied in order to think about the public interest test.
I'm going to come to some operational questions in a second, but just in terms of, consumers and, we represent our constituents, I can see that we would want our constituents to be prevented from investing in something that you guys know is crooked, a Ponzi scheme, something that's completely flaky. But one of the operational issues that we're concerned about is that it takes the FCA such a long time to complete an investigation. And so I'll move on to the operational questions, and we'll have more questions on this subject as we go on. average length of an investigation is nearly 4 years, and so that seems an awfully long time for a question mark to be hanging over an organisation once you've named them. And in terms of the operational point there, Nikhil, it says in the consultation that you already, had questions from committees like ours about specific cases that you weren't able to speak about. But I think you have used your quote-unquote sort of emergency naming powers once or twice, and you do already have those, don't you?
Yes, so today we have the flexibility under exceptional circumstances in the public interest to name in a very
you already have
in
that
a very
power.
in a very specific and in a very specific way. One of the committees that's raised this issue with us was the Public Accounts Committee in 2022 after the NAO did a report into the British Steel pension scheme situation.
We've published the letter you sent us yesterday.
And one of the concerns there was we had information and intelligence about problematic financial advisors, and these were small businesses, and they were being investigated. It takes a certain amount of time to investigate. I'll come to your point in a minute around the length of time, and that the steel workers in Port Talbot, the pensioners, were not aware we were investigating. They were calling our hub up, our contact centre. All they got was the information, this firm is on the register, nothing else was disclosed. They then took advice and potentially lost their life savings. And that was the point that the Public Accounts Committee asked us to look into in this context. Is there more that we can say in those circumstances? Our judgment is, and this is a delicate judgment, because there is no regulator quite like us anywhere in the world or domestically.
But you've already got the powers that
have
allowed you to make that disclosure, haven't you?
In exceptional circumstances, we don't think that power would have worked in the British Steel case. You asked us about the OD asset management situation, and we disclosed to you one or two other cases we have, but it's a very small number of cases.
But you don't think the powers would have applied in this case?
We think it would be difficult in this case to have said that was exceptional, because sadly, investment fraud is not exceptional. We are investigating a large number of those situations at any one time. There are other circumstances, so I think in our letter, and obviously I know the subcommittee is going to look at it, we're playing a more significant role in the government's economic crime plan. Nearly half the actions we are leading or contributing to, including in relation to fraud. There's a major initiative there. That's unlike many other of our international counterparts. There's a case which we gave to you, which we did supervisory work on. In parallel, the Serious Fraud Office opened an investigation. And in doing that, they said, any witnesses, any investors affected, please give us this questionnaire, send us this questionnaire so we can look at the evidence. Charging decisions have now been made in that case, and I won't comment any further. It so happened that the Serious Fraud Office took that case, but then we can take cases like that as well where there's a regulatory breach. There's a question of how you encourage witnesses to come forward. Sometimes that's also relevant in the non-financial misconduct domain as well when we're investigating a firm. Whistleblowing, which Ashley talked about, and we have had your recommendation on the Sexism in the City report around promoting awareness around our whistleblowing line, and we're taking that very seriously. But there's two issues with our whistleblowing function at the moment. One is awareness, one is confidence. And the whistleblowers continually tell us, both directly and in the surveys, that they don't have confidence in the framework because we don't say much more to them than we're taking your information seriously, it's been passed to the team. We don't tell them, because we're not able to, that their concern is being formally investigated because of the restrictions we're operating under. And that impacts that framework for whistleblowing as well. And sometimes in fast-moving consumer situations, and this is different to enforcement investigation. It's about unauthorised business, but there are some parallels. For example, FTX, and I've raised this point. We were the first G7 regulator to put a public warning out about FTX. We were very careful in our wording. We said in September 2022, we believe they may be operating illegally in the United Kingdom. Please be careful. That firm subsequently collapsed in the United States in 2022, and there's now been a criminal conviction in 2024. We did that at the same time as knowing this is one of the largest crypto firms in the world. The UK, like many other jurisdictions, was vying to win its business. But the information we had at that point was sufficiently serious for us to feel we had to say something.
Yeah. So you've
publicly.
already got quite a lot of powers. Is really the
some,
point
but I don't think they would work for a number of these situations. Is what I'm saying, Chair. And I think that we also have increasingly work with partner agencies on digital regulation and other areas where they name, such as Ofcom. So we are a regulator beyond financial services, and we don't at the moment. So those are the considerations. But we recognise this as a debate, and we're very grateful that the subcommittee is looking at this, because this is exactly what the accountability framework is set up for, on these contentious issues, to try to make sure we get the democratic input of this committee.
Okay, so the consultation's closed. When are we going to hear what you've decided?
So what we've said is we're going to take several months. There's obviously been a response from industry, from consumer groups, from whistleblowing campaign groups and others. We hope that will give time for the subcommittee to consider. We've written back to the subcommittee, and the House of Lords is also looking at this, so we will obviously be really interested to hear what your feedback is, and in a number of months' time we'll be able to come back with where we've got to.
Okay, thank you. So moving on, you mentioned the sexism in the city report, and you've sent us a reply on that, which we've published as well. And one of the things that we fed back to you was around the data gathering exercise, that we felt that too much emphasis on a data gathering exercise would end up just being tick box rather than actual cultural change. But it sounds from your reply as though you're just going to go ahead with that anyway.
Well, thank you for the recommendations, and thank you for taking evidence from us. I think where we are on that is, firstly, there were two elements to our consultation. One was on non-financial misconduct and clarifying our guidance, and you recommended that we move ahead with that. So we are prioritising our work on non-financial misconduct and being clearer that that does constitute an area where we may be able to take action. And I think you're familiar with some of the cases. On the broader data and diversity questions, we had 257 responses, so there's been a very extensive response to the consultation. We are not prioritising moving forward on that at this stage. We need to take the time to understand it. And of course, you've given us a number of other recommendations which we were looking at, including engaging with boards and senior leadership, supporting equality impact assessments for family-friendly policies, and you've asked us to do an equality impact assessment on the bonus gap. So we also need to think about, for those recommendations, what data we would need to have to be able to fulfil those recommendations, and that will take some time. So the priority right now for us is the non-financial misconduct guidance that you recommended to move forward with.
Thank you. And just for the record, actually, we're publishing that response next week, so I'm just correcting my own mistake there. Finally, on debanking, you'll have seen our report out this morning, and I appreciate that business lending and business banking is not really something that is within your perimeter. But were you as shocked as we were to discover in the course of that inquiry about the extent to which businesses undertaking completely legitimate activities in the United Kingdom economy are being debanked by the banking sector?
It's an issue of concern, and we're doing work which we launched in the summer last year on provision of banking services. We published an initial report which focused around the question of freedom of expression and political views. We're doing some broader work, and we'll say some more later this year. This question of debanking and de-risking across the financial system is a concern. It's a concern not just in the United Kingdom, it's also a concern in the United States and other jurisdictions. And I can entirely understand the committee's legitimate concern around companies doing legal activity who may have difficulty obtaining bank accounts. As the committee will be familiar, in the UK, banks have full commercial freedom over the types of businesses they do or do not bank.
But you were very clear last summer at the FCA in terms of the consumer lens shone by Mr Farage's account being closed, that you shouldn't have an account closed because of your political beliefs for
Absolutely,
an individual.
That's very clear under the law.
And I just wondered whether you were as surprised as we were on this committee to discover how many businesses are being debanked because it turns out that they're in an industry that perhaps their shareholders don't particularly like defending our country.
Yeah, so this is clearly an increasing problem. It's an increasing problem for companies in certain sectors.
Does the law need to change on this?
There is a judgment for government and parliament to make as to
Yeah.
whether banking is such a fundamental service that there should be some kind of right, and other jurisdictions have a backstop right, where if a entity or enterprise that needs a bank account can't get one, there is a backstop mechanism. That's never been the choice that's been made by the government or parliament in this country, but that does exist elsewhere. But clearly you need a bank account to be able to operate your business, and we are hearing from pawnbrokers, crypto firms, charities, cash-intensive businesses, even businesses like adult entertainment, defence, all of these types of businesses that may be legal, that they can't get necessarily the bank of their choice. That has been that commercial freedom has been long-standing in the United Kingdom, though.
Okay, interesting. Siobhan?
I just wanted to look at the motor finance investigation and hidden discretionary commission arrangements. As you'll know, that is where banks allow car dealers to unfairly raise the interest rates on people's car finance so that they could increase their commission and earn more money. Nearly half of all car finance deals were affected, with an average family losing about £1,100 over 4 years. The best estimate we have is that £16 billion is owed to customers who were overcharged. The last time we had a scandal of this size was PPI, where customers had to claim the money themselves, often giving 40% of their compensation to a claims management company. This time around, will the FCA be setting up a redress scheme to help customers who have been overcharged?
We made an intervention in January after board approval to pause the processing of complaints until September this year. We were seeing an increase in the number of complaints going to the Financial Ombudsman Service, and as reported by firms, there were also a significant number of court cases in the county courts. And learning the lessons from past experience, and also given the cost of administering those, we took that exceptional action in relation to a pause so that we could appoint an expert to look at all the evidence across the market to understand the situation, understand what's happening here. That process is now well underway. What's important in that process is that firms provide us the data comprehensively and promptly so we can assess the evidence. There's also legal issues in dispute, and one of the parties that has been subject to a particular decision by the Financial Ombudsman Service has taken that to judicial review. We have applied to the court to be a party to that judicial review so that we can contribute our thoughts to how the courts might resolve some of those legal questions. So as we look at that evidence, as we look at where the jurisprudence emerges out of the senior courts that will now look at this issue, we will then take a view as to what further action may be needed. What I've said publicly, but I haven't wanted to go further than that until we have assessed the evidence, I think it's unlikely from our work that we're going to find nothing to report. But I also wouldn't want the committee to think that this is going to be on the same scale as PPI. We will have to assess what we do against all of our objectives, including ensuring the market functions well. 78% of households in the United Kingdom own a car, and it's in all of their interest and our interest to make sure we continue to have a functioning motor finance market in the UK.
But if you find significant wrongdoing, people subject to discretionary commission arrangements, do you think you will be setting up a redress system?
That is absolutely one of the options we have open to us under the law. There are a number of tests that we have to meet if we want to go down that route in terms of the evidence base, and that's what we are gathering at the moment. It's one of the options we would need to assess based on the evidence we receive. We have set out on our website and also sought to encourage consumers not to use claims management companies. As you point out, well, everyone's entitled to use a solicitor to represent them, and sometimes claims management companies appear in the form of legal advisors. When we have done schemes like this in the past, we have wanted as much of any redress to go direct to a consumer and not to an intermediary. But I'm not making any presumption about what we in the board may or may not decide in this. We have to wait for the evidence to come through.
But should you go down that route, would you announce specific penalties for firms that kind of game the system by failing to identify claimants or paying them less than they're entitled to?
The example I can give you, which is where we have used these powers most recently, is in relation to the British Steel pension scheme, where we launched a redress scheme. We made it very clear that anyone who seeks to circumvent the process would be subject to penalties. We have taken unprecedented enforcement action in that case. There is some information in the letter we sent to the House of Lords. 15 individuals have been banned. We've acted against a number of firms as well. In the case of motor finance, in recent weeks we've written to those companies affected and made it clear what our expectations are around the maintenance of financial resilience at all times, which means that if there are going to be unusual distributions back to shareholders or other unusual capital movements, we expect to be notified in advance, and there should be nothing that might undermine their ability to pay consumers what they may be owed at the end of this exercise, and we'll be monitoring that very closely.
And there is a big concern often amongst consumers that banks are able to put a great deal of pressure on institutions such as your own to set up schemes that let them off a bit more likely. And I'm sure you probably know that in a previous scandal about interest rates hedgings, Martin Wheatley, who was the CEO of the FCA at the time, told this committee that he hadn't come under any pressure to be easy on the banks, but an independent report then found an internal email proving that he had. With this in mind, have the banks put any pressure on the FCA to go easy on them by setting up a scheme that allows them to pay less compensation or to pay it out more slowly?
I think if you look at the line of questioning from the Chair at the start around the response to enforcement consultation, I think you can see we take our decisions based on the evidence and independently. It'll be of no surprise to you that the trade associations representing banks and motor finance companies are making very strong representations to us, and I'm aware they're making strong representations to this committee as well, and likewise consumer groups. That's a normal part of the policy-making process. We will make our decisions based on the evidence against the statutory objectives that are given to us by Parliament, as we set out publicly.
But in any dispute like this, it's really important that both sides have clout, isn't it, to inform your discussions about how you set the scheme up. And so my concern would be, and those of other kind of lay people, is that the consumer side isn't as strong or influential as the bank side.
We hear that frequently. Obviously, within the framework of the FCA, there's a statutory consumer panel with whom we are engaging with, and we respond and engage. And obviously, the consultation is open. If we do a redress scheme, the consultation is open to everybody, including Parliament, including this committee. I'm sure, through the subcommittee may, if we go down that route, that might be the kind of consultation this committee may wish to engage on. So I think we would seek to do it openly. And with all of these situations, whether it's enforcement consultation, the work we're doing on motor finance, the work we're doing on debanking, our approach in recent years has been to lay out as much of the evidence as transparently as we can about the different objectives and how we're trying to balance the different objectives. And then we know we're going to have to, at some point, make decisions and draw lines under the board's oversight, and this would be a board decision ultimately, and we set out and explain it. And I would hazard a guess that when it comes to decision time, I would imagine nobody's going to be satisfied with us, because it is you have very polarised views on some of these topics.
And just my final question, Chair, is that your investigation covers April 2007 to January 2021. Why is mis-selling of car finance prior to April 6, 2007 out of scope? Because there has been some speculation, particularly in the media, that this practice was starting as early as the 1980s.
FOS jurisdiction commenced in 2007, so there's also legal time bars that we have to consider, and that's all part of the evidence gathering that we are undertaking. And indeed, that is sometimes what the legal time bar is also something that sometimes is considered by the courts as well, and I'm sure it will feature in this conversation as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you, Siobhan. Trez.
Other colleagues are going to discuss things like budgets and similar, but I just want to get a sense of prioritisation and how that works between the executive and non-executive in that. You do have statutory duties. You had a new statutory duty added, actually a secondary objective about competitiveness and growth. So, in my short time on the committee, I think it's been quite interesting to observe that there are things very much of interest to consumers. So things like access to cash, and again, my colleague will go into that in more detail. I've just had bad news today, Madam Chairman, that TSB are closing a branch in Felixstowe.
I had exactly the same bad news today. They're closing the last bank in town in Tenbury Wells, TSB.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but coming back to that, one of the things that's really everybody is very eager to hear from you from is about the proposals that you're coming up with that will, in that regard. It does feel like that's taking some time. I think the other aspect, which I was surprised, is quite how long it's taking to do some of the regulatory elements connected to the Edinburgh Mansion House reforms. And I guess looking here, trying to understand what you're prioritising, because ultimately we need a financial system we can trust, but we do need one that's responsive to consumers and that will still exist in years to come. So instead of you having 40,000 businesses, we don't want you to end up with just 4,000 because the market's gone elsewhere. So help me understand how you are prioritising in that regard.
Okay, so from a board perspective, if you look at the main sort of headline topics or headline areas that we prioritise at the moment, we can arguably split them up into consumer protection. Now, there's a lot to unpack there. Of course, we have the ongoing implementation of Consumer Duty, which is a flagship reform.
Yeah.
Underneath that, or as part of it, there are important shifts as to how the organisation will operate over the next few years, including a shift from a prescriptive approach, or possibly even overly prescriptive approach to outcomes. So that's one. There's a clear focus on investment fraud and how the organisation tackles that, again, from a number of different dimensions. When it comes to consumers under pressure, particularly those in financial distress, you've seen the work we've done around forbearance and similar, or forbearance expectations. Again, when it comes to consumer vulnerabilities and risks, how promotions are communicated and what promotions say, and the disciplines around promotions. That's just kind of flavour, but it's really that's under the heading of the broader heading of consumer protection. There's a special area, in my view, or particular area of importance, which is consumer investments. And that's where we're working on, and it crosses into the Edinburgh reforms, that's where we're working on advice guidance boundary, which, again, my view is that is absolutely critical because it is aimed at a very, very large, what has been termed help gap. I think we know what that is. And what are the credible techniques and impactful techniques we can use to fill that gap. We are also looking at the whole question of disclosure to consumers, and that's moving away from PRIPS to an alternative, and also the work we are doing internally, operationally, around a tighter gateway. In other words, it is tougher to be authorised now than it has been in the past. You can see that through the statistics. So that's, and then.
So how are you balancing the secondary competitiveness objective?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it earlier on. So the sort of third bucket, as it were, is consumer investments, broader consumer protection, and then the third bucket is it's often termed wholesale markets. I think it's really, really important because if you look at a topic to deal with, well, it's a topic to deal with on a practical level. If you look at the many opinions and viewpoints about UK competitiveness as an equity capital market, as a wholesale finance centre, there's obviously a great deal of concern around that, and particularly when it comes to the often cited examples of where companies choose to list, for example. So I think so far as my own view is that so far as competitiveness is concerned, the work we're doing around listing rules, and frankly that is, in my view, a radical change from a sort of ex-ante protective approach to a disclosure approach. We're working on something called the Intermittent Trading Venue. It's now got a new name or a new acronym, but nevertheless, that's really about bridging private markets to public markets.
So I know about what you're planning to do. I guess my question is about pace, prioritising resources. So you're 2 years into, you're in the final year of your 3-year strategy. I don't know when your next strategy is due to come out. But recent consultation enforcement seem to get priority for publication now. And I'm just wondering why that's timely, why that's still your priority, as opposed to, I think you've got quite a small team working on various of the reforms that actually could unlock the economy and avoid the fall in competitiveness. So that's why I'm trying to push on prioritisation of resources.
I completely agree on the unlocking the economy point.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we are doing at the moment on both the supply side, in other words, the supply of enterprises that are able to attract investment, and on the demand side, the supply of capital to interact with those enterprises. That's critical. In terms of what we're looking at going forwards, our next strategy will kick off formally in April 2025. So as you would expect, we're working on that now at an executive level and a board level. I think it is one aspect of that, and this goes back to the enforcement consultation, and you're sort of saying, where does that fit in the context of prioritisation? One aspect of that is effectively a sort of reset as to how we deploy our enforcement resources, our supervisory resources, and how we operate the gateway. And the fundamentals behind that, and it does come to speed, without doubt. I think it was mentioned by the chair earlier on that there's a perception that the enforcement often is perceived to take too long.
It's not a perception. I think it's
or even a reality.
Data that you've shared with us. Yeah.
So I think so we agree with that. Yeah. So the enforcement consultation fits within a broader piece of work which we are currently developing. So we haven't announced anything formally at the moment, but basically it's around making sure that our early interventions, whether at gateway or as a supervisor, operate in a way that are calculated to nip problems in the bud early on, so that the number of cases, the sheer number of cases that end up being sitting within enforcement, around which we launch investigations, there should be fewer, but they should be targeted at the greatest harms, as you would expect, as distinct from an approach which some regulators take, which is if something comes through the door, you investigate it until the point at which you drop it some way down the track, and you're not necessarily triaging and managing the cases in a disciplined way. Now that sounds very operational and such like, but it is.
Right, I mean, operational.
It is.
It doesn't feel it's coming across as good operation.
Yeah.
It's taking nearly 4 years to do investigations.
I think it's a very fair question about pace. I think when I think about the competitiveness objective, there are different dimensions to it. The first thing I hear from firms is operation efficiency. We have moved our authorisations performance very sharply. 97.8% of applications are processed within statutory timelines. Senior manager applications are dealt with on average within 40 days. We started digitising our forms, so we keep improving that operational efficiency. Before we get to any of the reforms on the policy, the first thing you hear from industry is make sure that works. We've done that at the same time as raising the bar. So 1 in 4 are rejected post the LCF recommendations, because we learnt that if you block things at the gateway, you can save an awful lot of time, an awful lot of damage to consumers and industry. So we've taken a very robust approach on crypto and in other areas. So that has moved fundamentally. You've also seen, I think, in the letter, which I believe you've published, a whole set of other actions on prevention of fraud. 14, 15 times more interventions on fraudulent financial promotions, twice as many for unauthorised businesses, more skilled persons reviews. The reason I mention that, I think you heard it from the CEO of Santander UK, one of the biggest drains on competitiveness for the financial services industry, and indeed the United Kingdom economy, is fraud and financial crime. and we are stepping up. We have to work with partners, but if we can really, and the investment forward numbers in the UK have come down in absolute terms by 40% over year on year. Now that's still too much, but it's come down, and that helps your constituents, it helps the financial services industry, and it's one of the reasons why we work so proactively with Google to get that down. So that plays into competitiveness as well. And then we have a set of innovation services which I believe are seen as world leading. 95 countries around the world copied our sandbox, our regulatory sandbox. We convene the 85 regulators on the global financial network. We're consulting on a digital sandbox for tokenization. We're consulting on work around asset management and tokenization. So we're at the forefront of innovation. As we do that, we need to have an open conversation with this committee and others in Parliament about risk, because these innovations are not without risk. Some of them will go wrong. And we need to have a good understanding about how far we should go, and that also plays into the listings conversation as well. I can run through all of the Edinburgh reforms. We have been delivering each one of them. A number of them await Treasury statutory instruments, and I think in this committee's own analysis, there's certain work for the Treasury to do, and then we can kick in and do our bit of the equation.
Okay. That's helpful to know. I wonder if perhaps you could write to us with that, and then we can interrogate the Minister on there. But
Super. Thank you very much. Anne-Marie.
Thank you. A helpful introduction from my colleague. It is indeed access to cash and consumer duty that I'm perhaps to touch on. Mr. Alder, we regularly talk about banking cuts. So can I ask you where we are with this? Clearly it's not your responsibility to ensure that cash access actually deliver. You are producing regulations to ensure that there is a process whereby when the last branch closes, there is a hub in place a year later. And at the moment, the banks are operating in accordance with government guidance, but there is no regulation. What's happening in practice on the ground is that we have something like 40 hubs now established. We have something like 140 in the pipeline. And from every conversation I've had with those in the industry, it's extremely unlikely that those 140 are all going to meet the 12-month. Some of the banks, notably Barclays, have actually said that they will agree to keep their branches open even if it's longer than 12 months, there's no hub. But I, for example, in Teignmouth, a branch we've just discussed before, the Lloyds branch, who have not committed to extend, that will close in June. At the moment, the community have absolutely no idea whether a hub has been identified, temporary or permanent. And it seems to me that without the communication, and we've had very little with cash access, without taking the community with you, you're going to find that this hub, Brave New World, replacing, if you like, the branches, is going to be seen as something which is, frankly, not happening, and not really the, if you like, the cure or the offered solution to the closure of bank branches. It seems to me it's also probably not complying with the cross-cutting rules in consumer duty. So are we avoiding foreseeable harm by closing branches without replacing them? Are we helping our customers pursue their financial objectives by closing branches without a replacement? I don't think we are. As a regulator there, well, I know your rules are currently being baked. Surely there is a role, given the consumer duty obligations and what you know is the intention of the Act and what the Minister has said, to intervene to ensure that this works, because right now it's not working. Mr. Alder, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, firstly, in relation to the topic as a whole, the subject as a whole, the impact on communities, and in particular people within those communities, often the more vulnerable. Obviously, we have a great deal of sympathy. First point. So, but the question then is, what are we doing about it, and what are the banks doing about it? Our expectation under our branch closure guidance is pretty clear, and the expectation is that with the consumer duty overlay playing a part, is that banks that are closing branches look at the impact that might have on before they close on the customers that they are serving. Ultimately, as it now stands, before we make rules, which is not too far in the distant future, the question of whether a bank closes a branch or not is ultimately up to the bank. But that is our expectations, and we communicate with the banks around the decision making closely. So that's what's happening at the moment.
But Mr. Alder, given the consumer duty, which you do have the power to enforce now, surely you do have the remit to be able to step in when the banks, in this case, in my case, for Tinman, Barclays, are not meeting your guidance or indeed customer expectation.
So I understand the point, and I think that this is clearly, to Dr. Coffey's comment earlier, and I'm sorry to hear about Felix Day this afternoon, and I hope Link look at the position in particular with respect to deposit services in your constituency, and we'll keep an eye on that. The Parliament debated this vigorously last year and set a framework for access to cash, which set out that the Treasury publishes a policy statement about what is determined as reasonable access to cash. We should regulate against that policy statement. And there was also an extensive debate in Parliament about whether we should have a power to prevent closure of branches, and Parliament did not go down that route.
Agreed, and you and I are not disagreeing.
My point is that when it comes to the consumer duty point, we then have to be careful in using the consumer duty beyond what has been explicitly legislated for in Parliament and debated in Parliament. And therefore we don't think we would be able to use the consumer duty to sort of assume a power that you have explicitly decided not to give us. What you've asked us to do is to make sure that there is reasonable access to cash. It's channel neutral. Whether that's a banking hub, a post office, or an alternative service. And there was also a separate discussion about personal and business as well, and that's also reflected in the Treasury's policy statement. But I entirely understand that the frustration with the speed with which banking hubs are being rolled out, and is this going to be the long-term perfect solution? Let's wait and see. But I entirely understand the point you're making. I was visiting Cumbria just a few weeks ago, and I saw some of this really right at the front line of what is happening in some of those rural areas.
But Mr. Rathi, that doesn't answer the question. The fact that Parliament debated these two things separately, access to cash and consumer duty, and that they are in separate parts of the legislation, does not mean they are unrelated. And it does not mean that there is no responsibility and obligation on the part of the regulator, yourselves, to ensure that the consumer duty, which says cross-cutting obligation to avoid foreseeable harm and to help customers pursue financial objectives, that is live law now. Are you still telling me there is nothing you as the regulator can and will do to look at, address what you yourself acknowledge is a complete failure to deliver on the promise with regard to the rollout of the banking hubs in 12 months or the last branch closing? So
we don't think we can use the consumer duty to intervene in commercial decisions to close branches. What we have done under our guidance is we have, and a number of banks have paused decisions where we feel their plans for closure have not been satisfactory. Once the new rules are in force, we will have a little bit more bite, somewhat more bite, to prevent a closure where the suitable alternative has not been identified and is not up and running. And there will also be additional ability for community groups, including members of Parliament, to make requests for cash access needs to be considered. So I'm not trying to. I in some respects, one could. The ability to ask banks to pause commercial decision making would be very helpful in me coming here and answering these questions. I don't think we could go that far at the moment.
Well, clearly you are the regulator, I am not. But it would seem to me that those duties are meaningless if they don't include looking at the commercial decisions that banks make. Because ultimately, when you're looking at what banks do, they are all commercial decisions. But let's leave it there, because clearly we're not going to agree. And I'm not sure where that leaves the residents of Tinmouth and the residents of Dawlish, who currently have a final branch closing next month, June, and know nothing about whether or not there will be a hub. But let us move on.
I understand in your in the briefing I've received is that the 2 hubs are on the way and by September, but one in July, one in September. That was my understanding. But
and so there will be a gap.
And we're happy to look at the specific case to understand if there is a gap.
If you would, I would be
absolutely.
very grateful.
Yeah.
I would be very grateful.
Thank you.
Let us move on then, because if we move then on to the consumer duty specifically, there was grace period for legacy products, closed products. So Rathi, how is that coming on? Because there were all sorts of issues about vested rights, vulnerable consumers, migration challenges, effectively where the closed or legacy product didn't meet the new consumer duty. Where have you got to? Has that given rise to some issues and problems?
Well, firstly, I'd say I think we're very grateful to the industry for the work they've done to implement the consumer duty, both for on-sale products last year and the work they're doing to deliver it by the end of July this year for closed book products. It's been a significant regulatory change, and we're seeing very significant progress in the market. It's not all visible and announced, but we're seeing better, simpler, more accessible language being used for products. We're seeing more upfront language about exclusions. Some fees have been restructured, some you'll be familiar with because they are in the public domain. We've seen sludge practices ended, and there's been some good progress on savings and technology investment to get customer insights into a better place. So we are seeing good progress. There are certain areas of focus that we are focusing on, and I can say more about that. On the closed book, in our latest survey, which we ran in April, 83% of firms were aware of the deadline. The issues that are coming up as thematic issues, which they are working through, are one, data. Some of these are very old products, and they don't always have data about the customers, and indeed some of the customers are disengaged. So the sort of the customers you can't reach, you can't contact, who don't seem to want to respond. How do you address that market? There are questions around, as you say, vested contractual rights and how they communicate around those issues too. There are questions about some of these products being on legacy systems, and there are particular questions around vulnerable customers. Those are the themes that are coming through. We're working with the firms. We have a large population, as Dr. Coffey talked about, 40,000 firms. We have to be sensible and proportionate. For a smaller firm, this may be harder than for a large retail bank. And I would also stress, again linking back to the enforcement conversation we had earlier, and I've said this publicly, we're not looking to enforce every technical breach of the duty on day one.
So
where we will go for
the deadline to be met.
I think the bulk of firms are going to make reasonable, strong endeavours to meet that deadline. Can I guarantee you there won't be technical breaches on the 1st of August? No, I can't.
No, sure.
But what we're also saying is we're not going to go and enforce every single technical breach that we identify. When a new piece of regulation comes into place, that will not be sensible. What we're focusing on is the most egregious breaches and the egregious harms, so that firms can adjust to this new regime in an orderly way. What we want to see is reasonable efforts to meet the deadline.
One final question for Mr. Alder. Mr. Rathi has given us, if you like, an overview that all's going swimmingly, effectively, with regard to the 4 outcomes of consumer duty and the 3 cross-cutting roles. But what we need is metrics. What I think I'd like to understand, Mr. Alder, is what changes are going on within your organisation itself to ensure that you can actually ensure compliance with those 4 outcomes which are now required, and that the cross-cutting rules are complied with.
Yeah, I think with consumer duty, I think it's still, although it came into effect last July, I think it's still fairly early days. I think as Nikhil has explained in relation to our interaction with the industry and expectations of the industry with around closed books, it's an iterative conversation. So my view at the moment is that we're not yet at a stage of nailing down the precise metrics, certainly quantitative metrics, by which we were going to hang our hat in relation to the success or otherwise of the consumer duty. Having said that, we're obviously very alive to the way in which consumer duty is actually having an impact. And Nikhil went through a few examples. We had a discussion at the last committee on savings rates. You've seen activity around wealth management and platforms and such like. There's a list. I won't go on. So those examples of changes in behaviour, and frankly, the genuine engagement by firms with the FCA and the duty is all important. All of that is important certainly for the board as a whole to understand as to how the duty is being embedded. I would say that there are kind of two elements of it, which, again, is not capable of being judged by quantitative metrics or even qualitative yet. One which I think are very important. I mentioned one earlier on, which is the sort of set of expectations absolutely reasonable about what how we shift to an outcomes-based approach. And the second is fair value assessments, which is quite a large conversation we're having with a number of institutions. It's quite an important one. Nikhil and other executives have made absolutely clear that is not about price setting. Fair value is not an isolated price setting or price fixing exercise. It's much broader than that, which is, again, why it's an iterative approach. But I think actually, just to conclude, I think you can see already, even though it is early days and it's a big shift, it's a flagship initiative. You can see already that there has been impact, and Nikhil's mentioned some of those, and I have as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Stephen.
Good afternoon, and I apologise that I had to step out for a statutory instrument committee, such as the vagaries of parliamentary life. Could we perhaps go back to enforcement and both the consultation and other matters? Firstly, in terms of the consultation, obviously I heard your answers to the chairman, Mr. Alder. But if I read the consultation, you're going from your long-maintained presumption against publication to a new position of using a flexible public interest framework, but there'll be no presumption in favour of disclosure. Mm-hmm. So have you done any, looking at where you haven't used that presumption in favour of name before, have you given any thought as to how many more people this might be now being disclosed, or it seems odd.
Letter only reached yesterday, but we set out for the committee in Annex A of our response to the subcommittee all the cases from 2023-24 where we opened investigations. There were 15 investigations into regulated firms, 11 investigations into regulated firms, 4 into listed firms, and 12 into unregulated firms. 6 of the investigations into regulated firms are already disclosed. The firms themselves, or in one case we disclosed, they're listed,
but some
have disclosed obligations, some of them disclosed in their listing obligations. We set out an example of case 7, which if you get to in the annex, which is, I don't want to give any sense of what the firm is, but that firm has announced that it may be under investigation by a range of authorities in an overseas securities market. It is subject to enforcement actions in other jurisdictions as well. It has several million UK consumers. We have surfaced that. We haven't done a full assessment, but that is the kind of case where we might think that we would want to, in a very factual and measured way, simply confirm that an investigation is underway. We've given you 3 other cases where we would have to weigh the test, and there's no presumption, and 1 case which is a covert criminal case, yep, we would not disclose.
But can we just go with that? Is the reason why you might want to, in that particular instance, which I think you called case 7, is that because it would fit the public interest test you're sitting out, or is it because you're concerned that other people might be considered as that firm, and therefore you want to get rid of that possibility of speculation?
It wouldn't be about speculation. The concern would be there are several million UK consumers using this firm. We are investigating it. And we have had discussions with this firm for 3 years. So this point around, you asked another question in there as to do these investigations come out of nowhere? Every single one of those cases which I have left, which are unannounced, they've all had supervisory engagement for between 1 and 3 years. Sometimes we've had Section 166s, sometimes we've had supervisory action plans, sometimes we've had private voluntary agreements with the firms which they have not complied with, and therefore we've opened an investigation. We're also mindful that some of our regulatory partners around the world have public enforcement actions underway in relation to that institution. Therefore, we consider, but this is exactly the kind of debate we want to have with you, in that kind of case, we don't think it meets the exceptional circumstances test that we have in place today. We don't think that would qualify, and we therefore think that's the kind of case which we may wish to consider. There are other cases, that the covert case, which is a fraud case, investment fraud case, is a criminal investigation, rather like the other one I mentioned to the Chair earlier. There may come a point where we feel it's necessary to announce, once we've gathered enough evidence, where we may wish to secure more witnesses. The bar for criminal charges is high. The evidential threshold you need to meet is high, and you want to gather as much evidence as possible. We're not there yet, but those are the kinds of cases which we are talking about in terms of a public interest test. We will not be, and obviously anything to do with financial stability, we will talk to the PRA. Of course, we'll be very thoughtful about that. So those are the kinds of considerations we wish to share with the committee, and it reflects the breadth of responsibilities we have, unlike any other regulator in the UK or around the world. It's in real life.
So you think you need potentially this power, even though there is a method at the moment already to publicise enforcement investigations anonymously?
I think, for example, in the area of fraud or non-financial misconduct, if you need to name a firm to encourage witnesses to come forward, doing it anonymously would not do the trick. We haven't ruled out, in some cases, articulating the information anonymously, but that's not always going to be effective. And sometimes you have to be a bit careful, because what you might do is set off a round of speculation where the firms that are not under investigation deny it, and then subsequent rounds of speculation focus on all those firms that have not denied they're under investigation. So I'm not ruling it out, but we'd have to be very thoughtful about it. But I would also stress this is not, we will take our time over this to make sure we get it right. We've heard what the industry has said. We want to hear really in detail the evidence around the secondary competitiveness objective. We want to weigh that up.
Yeah, because that's actually, you've just come on to exactly what I want to ask. In your response to the Chairman, I think, the first response, you said, we're not aware of any significant evidence that the approach to disclosure undermines competitiveness. Given when you responded to the Chairman earlier, you were saying there are no other jurisdictions that are going to operate this in exactly the same way. What is there that gives you confidence that there isn't evidence that this would undermine competitiveness?
Can I just make sense? I think there's a sort of narrative around this, which is along the lines of this change would imply that in most cases we would be naming the subjects of investigation. It would be routine. That's now, I think what's important, and Nikhil's gone through a few examples of the sort of considerations and the sort of fact patterns that would be important in thinking through the public interest test. And from my perspective, the way in which Nikhil's articulated those considerations and the way they were articulated in the consultation itself are signalling, I think very, very strongly, that a public interest test which would incorporate those sort of considerations. And incidentally, one of our practitioner panels, in commenting on this, I think quite rightly, said, look, it would be good to know more about where you set the bar and the sort of considerations that you take into account, which may not be exclusive in coming up with a public interest decision around this. My short point is that a serious public interest test around disclosure in these circumstances, balancing all these factors, I do not believe on deeper analysis is inconsistent with the competitiveness objective.
Please just add on that. We also, the specific point we made there was around other regulators that do this in the UK, and there's a large number that do it in digital markets, in audit and elsewhere. And we haven't seen the competitiveness point, but we are going to look at the evidence very closely, and I'm sure you will as well. We're also very mindful that we are the most scrutinised regulatory authority in the United Kingdom in terms of parliamentary scrutiny. Independent analysis has shown we are before Parliament almost every month, primarily through this committee, but also other committees as well. So we know that if we egregiously or prejudicially name a firm, we'll be accounting to you very quickly about what we have done. And if you look at the approach we've taken, certainly my approach over the last few years, sometimes you invited me to talk about specific firms. I've tended to refrain. The only one where I've been proactive, with the support of the committee, was in the case of Google, where we judged that we needed a combination of public and intense private action to get Google to shift their policies to stop fraudulent paid-for financial promotions appearing on their website. I'm very glad we did, because to their credit, once they did that, fraudulent promotions nearly fell by 100%. So sometimes you need to say something. I don't think anything we say is going to affect Google's share price. So sometimes some of the arguments that you might hear around this, I think, are important to just articulate.
I understand that articulation. I guess the concern would be, as Mr. Alder has just pointed out, how high the public interest test is, where those barriers are, because it would be perfectly possible, if it were a low bar, that you could undermine significantly investor confidence in the functioning of markets of particular and the viability of particular firms by this action.
And we would be very thoughtful about that. You know, my career in financial services was started dealing with 2008-9 bank runs and financial stability, and supporting the interventions there. So I'm very conscious of the situation that can occur, and we would talk to the PRA obviously on a financial stability basis. We've tried to give you the evidence of the sheer number of cases that are already disclosed, so you can look at what actual impact it has. And in most cases, particularly for large firms, they make a technical disclosure in their accounts or in their listed documents. Investors note it. People around the world are familiar with the fact that very often for these large firms, they have dozens of these investigations running in many parts of the world, and they wait for announcements and updates. The SICCO, the Sixth Secondary International Competitiveness Objective, I really hope in this accountability framework we now have with the subcommittee, we can get into really detailed conversations about how we balance this with our primary objectives. I was reading your report this morning about SME finance. You have one of the recommendations to us among a number of them is that we should extend the FOS perimeter to deal with personal guarantees, because you've identified a gap. That is an absolute flashpoint on competitiveness in terms of what the banks and the industry say to us right now. That the way the FOS works, its inconsistency with the way it works in other jurisdictions, the lack of clarity to investors about when they might have to pay compensation and when they might not. And so if we were to move forward with your recommendation, I think we would get a lot of pushback on that investability in the UK secondary competitiveness argument. And we need to be talking to you about how do we trade off what you've told us you would like to see for the protection of small businesses in your constituencies with what the industry is going to tell us about what this is going to do to the investability of UK financial services. And that comes up here as well. You know, we think that tackling fraud more robustly is going to enable us to drive competitiveness and growth benefits, and our objective is for the UK economy, including financial services. We think that will help us being able to step into that more effectively than we're able to do at the moment.
Two more. Does that mean, just to answer your last point, obviously at the moment you're taking sometimes between 3 and 4 years to close investigations. Does that is this new power going to help you in that, and what exactly are you doing at the moment to decrease that length of time?
This is a very important point. We want to bring that time down. We have new leadership in enforcement started last year. They have brought the number of investigations down from 591 to 500, but they want to do that in a way which still delivers more outcomes. So we are closing cases where there's no further action sooner, which is why that number went up last year. So that, in one sense, that operational drive is more important than this particular consultation on transparency, because that's what's really going to drive the outcomes. All the work we've done on prevention, which we've laid out in the report, on our gateway, on appointed representatives, on financial promotions, on 15 times as many cancellations where firms are not using their permissions, all of that, we think, enables us to reduce the amount that goes into enforcement so that those precious resources can be focused on the most serious cases, because we're dealing with a lot more upstream, and we've set out all the data for the committee to consider. But I would also want to manage expectations, because there's only so far we can go. Because we're dealing with some of the most complex, serious organised crime cases in the United Kingdom. Criminal thresholds are high. The court system we made a charging decision in May last year we don't have a trial date for January 2026.
Order,
Sorry.
Mr. Rathi. I'm going to have to ask you to hold that thought and hold this further question, because as you can see, we are now having to vote. We're expecting at least 2 votes, but there are still a lot of questions that we want to ask you this afternoon. So I'm going to suspend the session now, and we will return after the several votes to carry on, if that's all right with you. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
I want to ask about the thing that's probably ought to be talked about on most doorsteps in the country, but in my experience never is, and that's pensions decumulation. The recent data on how many people take advice when they start taking their pensions early, as the law now allows them to do, isn't incredibly encouraging, because the percentage of people who took money out of their pension scheme early without taking advice was about 48% in 2018-19. It's now gone up to 58%, which means that those people who are accessing their pension early without any advice at all, and possibly making quite serious decisions that might affect them in later life, without any advice, has gone up to now 58%. Why is this? What are you going to do to try to ensure that people do take advice when they access their pension funds early?
I think we've been quite open, and we're doing some work with the Treasury on the advice guidance boundary review. The advice framework in the UK needs fundamental change, and some of it's legislation, some of it's regulation, some of it's specific to pensions, some of it's more broadly around savings and investment advice. And it's clear we need to aim for a framework where people in the UK are taking financial advice at the time they need to take financial advice at a price that they're willing to pay. And that's why we had the advice guidance boundary review consultation with the Treasury. That closed. We're looking very carefully at all the responses. We proposed some avenues to try to tackle this issue, and I know the Chair has some views on some of those avenues and has proposed amendments in Parliament as well. I think the specific developments over the last year or two, it's hard to be conclusive, Dame Angela, but cost of living pressures, we think, may have played a role.
So people, it's driving
down
people
on savings.
to think I've got some savings sat here, I need them really now.
Yeah, I need
and
them
not
really now.
think in an actuarial way about how that might actually mean they run out
in their long term
of support in their old age.
Absolutely, and you see that also with one is taking some of the savings out earlier than they might otherwise have done. The other is reducing contributions, and actually, while there has been some reduction in contributions, perhaps not as much as you might have thought, given the cost of living pressures we have seen, I think that points a little bit to the success of auto-enrolment. There's a degree of stickiness around pension contributions through auto-enrolment, but that also points to a more fundamental issue, which is and I did a speech on this a month or so ago, which is to secure the retirement that most people are expecting. Our level of saving at the moment is far off what is needed to secure what would, in today's terms, be an annual income of between £30,000 and £40,000, according to the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association, as to what would give you a suitable retirement.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose there's several issues here. I mean, the move from defined benefit schemes to defined contribution schemes in pension savings means that people have to become their own actuaries, really, if they're then allowed to take money out of their pension. It may look a simpler proposition than it actually turns out to be, because of the problems with how you take money out of a pension, which might lead to bigger shortfalls than you can imagine if you haven't taken advice. And now over half of people aren't taking advice as they decumulate. That's despite the fact that PensionWise offers free appointments for the over 50s. So what can you do and what can we do to try to ensure that if people do this, they do it in the fullest knowledge of the consequences, which are quite often much worse than people might imagine from the amounts they're taking out?
So we've done some work, and you've been very focused on this issue in terms of experiments and pilots on the nudge, pension nudge, and we've done that work with partners in the pension system. We have encouraged the DC pension providers to contact much earlier than one would normally consider making these decisions. So at the age of 40 to 45, to encourage people to think about sufficiency of savings. Some employers are taking a more proactive role here in terms of workplace education, and I think that's an area which I think is worthy of focus, because those who are saving may respond more actively to a prompt from their employer. But there are a number of issues here. One is the act of taking advice. The second is making sure the advice is of the right quality, and that's been an issue, as we've seen in previous cases.
Well, it isn't a sales pitch. I mean,
it isn't a sales pitch,
proper,
exactly.
Actuarially appropriate advice rather than join my pensions accumulator business.
And the third angle, which Ashley talked about at the start of this hearing, is we have an issue with the level of returns people are getting in their pensions. And that's where you get into the whole conversation about are our savings transmitting into the investment the economy needs for infrastructure, and in the way we need it in terms of long-term investment to get the returns that people need, because that's also a critical part of getting sufficient savings, getting the returns you need in your pension. Not just
is that
cash.
about bad investment decisions by pension funds, or is it about too much charges being made on the money which are hidden when people invest in, say, a DC pension pot? Where's the insufficiency coming from?
So the diagnosis, and the Chancellor has laid out a lot of his thinking on this in the Mansion House reforms, is that we have too many schemes that are underperforming, and therefore we don't have the firepower in our pension system, such as exists in Australia and Canada, to make very sophisticated long-term investment decisions in infrastructure and other things that might generate better returns, and that the system has veered towards greater risk aversion in investment choices rather than some of those long-term decisions. Now, we will be doing some work, and we will be publishing our framework in the coming weeks in terms of value for money, to make sure that long-term return for savers is an important dimension of the value for money analysis. We've also approved new products, a long-term asset fund, for example, to make it easier for defined contribution pension funds to access infrastructure with a different fee and liquidity regime. But I think this also goes back to a much more strategic question, which we talk about with the committee, which is risk appetite in the economy and the willingness to take risk over a very long time horizon. And how do we shift those societal and cultural barriers that we seem to have developed over recent years.
Okay, you said in answer to my first question that you thought the entire sort of landscape around pension saving, and particularly decumulation, needed fundamental reform. What would a much better structure look like to you?
So we have obviously the defined benefit schemes, which a certain generation
kind of
has
look after
benefited
themselves.
from.
Let's deal with the more individualised.
I think there's a question about, do we need as many? Several thousand, each with their own cost base, each with their own trustees, each with their own specific objectives. Again, if you look at Australia, Canada and other countries, they have a much more concentrated pensions system. Secondly, our performance management of pensions regulation and making sure they're delivering value for money. The professionalisation of trustees. We have a lot of lay people as trustees, which is important for the constituencies that are served by DC pension schemes, but perhaps when it comes to making the kind of actuarial judgments that you're talking about, they may not feel equipped necessarily to do so. We have said also that there's a gap in regulation with respect to investment consultants. It's something that your sister committee, the Work and Pensions Select Committee, has made recommendations on as well, to make sure that they are properly advising the pension funds. And then I do think we need a debate about sufficiency of contribution. And I think that's something ministers have previously raised, both in terms of employee and employer contributions. That's a very sensitive point to discuss at a point when we're coming out of a cost of living squeeze. That's not an easy discussion to have when there's still that pressure in the economy.
What about making it compulsory for pension-wise guidance to be given ahead of decisions to take money out of the pension fund early? Because let's face it, if people overdo that during a cost of living crisis and a funding squeeze now, they may get into their old age with insufficient savings, even if they had put enough away, and then the cost of dealing with their needs falls onto the state anyway.
I know that issue has been voted on in Parliament a few times, and Parliament hasn't gone down that route. There's always this judgment. I mean, everyone's offered a pension-wise appointment, but some people choose not to take it. And there will be people who say, I don't want to be forced into an hour-long conversation. I know what I want to do. And you should not be interfering with my right to make my own decisions. And we do get that feedback. We get that feedback also when it comes to defined benefit pension transfer. So there's always this judgment to be made, but I think that is something ultimately it probably is going to be a matter for government and Parliament to make a decision on whether you want to go compulsory. I think that'd be quite hard for us to move on.
Can I just ask about insider trading? There's been you've had a recent focus on insider trading in your enforcement and your communications with the market about all of that. Can you tell me how that came about? Because you've suddenly got more into enforcement in the aftermath of the pandemic, which is good. How endemic do you think insider trading is, and do you think your warnings have been enough to stop it? If not, do you think the enforcement you've embarked upon now will deter it?
Yeah, and if I may make a point on that linked to the enforcement consultation, those are the types of investigations we would not announce. Those types of criminal investigations until we have sufficiency of evidence. There was a delay in the court system during the pandemic. Cases are now coming through. We're pleased that there have been some significant convictions, including one case that was sent for retrial. It's important that we do enforce because there's a deterrent effect of enforcing, and we have been issuing warnings. The insider trading analysis that we do in terms of metrics is we do a survey around the practitioners in the market, which we will publish with our annual report later in the year, which asks practitioners, do they feel that we are doing a good job in keeping the markets clean? And that's one of the things that we use to test. The market participants tell us if they feel, if they feel we're on the case, and we'll give you that data with our annual report. And there's a mix of patterns of behaviour we're dealing with. Opportunistic insider trading, which can often be quite small amounts of money, relatively speaking, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pounds, someone who's got the tip from someone who knows something and has traded. And then the other ones, which take much longer and are much more difficult, and it goes to Mr. Hammond's point earlier about the cases that take a long time. These are serious organised criminals that are operating cross-border in multiple jurisdictions, and they're operating on an industrial scale in multiple markets, and we are cooperating with our partners around the world on this. Those take time. We have to coordinate who's taking what action. We have to coordinate our investigations. Sometimes they know we're investigating them, and they're quite brazen. But we all in our different jurisdictions have to meet the criminal thresholds, and we have.
But are they brazen because they don't think that insider trading is properly dealt with by those that regulate markets, and they think that the rewards are so large compared with the risks? It's a risk worth taking.
They're operating out of jurisdictions. We run global markets with technology where you can trade our markets, whether it's United Kingdom, United States, European Union. You can trade in our markets from anywhere around the world. They operate in jurisdictions where it's quite hard for us to reach and get the evidence we need. And we have to use multiple tools, covert and other, to secure the evidence we need and coordinate with our partners. Those are some of the hardest cases, and they take the longest. But again, going back to the enforcement point, when we look at timing of cases and no further action, we do not want to set a culture in our organisation which deters our investigation teams from going after those cases. We know when we put a lot of resources into those cases, the criminal threshold is high. We may not get there. We will work as hard as we can, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't put every effort to investigate. The other point I'd make, and it links to a broader point around technology, there's a lot of focus on equity markets. But 95% of the trading and volumes in the United Kingdom, wholesale markets, are non-equity. Fixed income markets, commodities, derivatives, all kinds of things. And the combination of the role of big technology, the role of artificial intelligence, the ability to trade asynchronously across a number of different markets, I think poses a huge challenge actually for us and authorities around the world in how do we spot abusive trading when it's being done on industrial scale through technology. And then also the interactions with social media. So for example, a deep fake of the Pentagon on fire was put out on social media by a third party. That appears to have moved the US market a little bit. But even a little bit of a move in the US market, if someone's trading on that, they can make a very large amount of money. So those are the kinds of behaviours that we need to invest in our technology to be able to tackle as best we can.
Very, very significant issues. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, no, thank you. Danny.
Great, thanks, Chair. Mr. Alder, I'll start with a couple of questions for you, please. I'm interested in the budget which you've approved and the what's going on in the organisation itself. Just going back, you probably saw Andy Haldane's cheeky comparison of the number of regulators to workers in the financial sector. In 1980, apparently, I don't know how I did this maths, that there was one regulator to 11,000 workers in the city, whereas in 2013, apparently, it's 1 to 300. And I don't think that's because we've lost a huge number of city workers. So I want to come up to date now, but I don't know. I don't think Haldane looked at what the figure would be today, but I presume it's bigger. Could you just look back, and I appreciate you've been in Hong Kong for some of this time, but looking back over the last 10, 15 years, how do you account for what has been significant growth in the sort of regulatory headcount in financial services?
I think actually, to use one word, complexity. I don't think complexity has not diminished, it's increased. I think Nikhil's given some good examples around the complexity which we will face into in relation to risks in wholesale markets, risks around technology. There are benefits, of course, to technology and benefits to AI and such like, but there are certainly risks which we've pointed out. So complexity. Yeah. I think also, if you go back to financial crisis, 2008, that inevitably resulted in far more focus around components of regulation, particularly around financial stability, but also around conduct. We go back to the LIBOR situation many years now ago. So I think those are all reasons why regulation as a whole, whether prudential or whether conduct, was taken more seriously, because there was a view that if you don't get it right, the consequences to pay, as we saw in the financial crisis, are very serious. So I think that's, my own perspective. Now, that's not getting into ratios and numbers and such like, because I don't think that's particularly meaningful. There's a point around compliance burden, which I think is you might be sort of thinking about. There is a point about compliance burden.
Well, just quickly, because in the new business plan there are indeed, there are all these new duties: consumer duty, financial promotions regime, the cost of regulating that's gone up, the access to cash we've been discussing, the advice guidance, boundary review, Treasury smarter regulatory framework. All of these are costs that essentially government has decided to impose on you. And I wonder to what extent you think that's the costs that you're required to find to pass on to the firms are an accurate reflection of the priorities that are being addressed here.
Let me give you a flavour, actually, from the budget perspective of where we're at now, or kind of overview from as you'd expect from a board perspective. The organisation has grown over the last few years, quite deliberately, in part to take on board and staff increased complexity and expanding remit, without any doubt. Where we're at now is basically a consolidation of headcount So there has been an expansion and it is consolidating. And that's what we're looking at in the current budget, and I would expect that consolidation will continue for some time. You can never guarantee that, but that's the expectation.
When you say consolidating, do you mean maintaining current headcount or decreasing it in due course? No, you mean you're not growing it any further.
Roughly maintain.
So can I just ask on that question? So the fees are going up this year quite substantially, having been frozen last year. Is that, I mean, it's nearly 9%, I think. Is that a reflection of the fact that they were frozen last year and you're, in a sense, catching up? Or, and do you expect that fee to go up again, or indeed your overall budget to rise again in a sort of similar proportion next year?
Yeah. There's an inflationary aspect to it.
Yeah.
There is an aspect to do with staff costs, inevitably, which is partly to do with growth, partly to do with pay scales. And there's an aspect around the contracts which every organisation has, which are increasingly focused on IT spend in practice. So those components are all material to the way in which the...
Leaving inflation out of it, though, do you expect your budget to consolidate?
Well, subject to those factors around inflation, staff costs, which we look at very carefully, and that's been a subject we've discussed in previous committees. And also the way in which we approach IT spend. But there's a really important point, which is that both the executive team and the board are heavily focused on efficiencies. So Nikhil and I have had discussions around efficiencies within the organisation. The objective of which is to make sure that we have a value for money framework within which we operate. As we're consolidating, as we are delivering under the remit we now have, it's very, very important to demonstrate internally and externally that we are able to achieve efficiencies. Okay. Now, that is being looked at board level with the executive every quarter through the year to assess how efficiencies are being developed through the organisation. Okay. So, yeah.
I mean, just amplify on the technology, like any other organisation, we place a lot of emphasis on operational resilience and cyber resilience for our firms.
Okay.
And that is a huge additional cost for firms because of the heterogeneous nature of the threat we're dealing with. That is our single biggest technology spend because of the scale of the threat, the level of data we have, and make sure it is protected. Before we can get to doing any of the exciting new things we want to do with technology in terms of data, analytics, machine learning, all artificial intelligence, all of those things, you have to keep the perimeter secure. And so to your point around what that might mean for the future, we are in a context which is very challenging geopolitically, and the nature of some of these threats are very, very serious for critical national infrastructure. And I think you will see that not just in our sector, but you'll see that in the energy sector, aviation sector, other sectors.
Understood. Okay, well, thank you for explaining that. Can I come on to you, Mr. Rathi, about a specific item of expenditure? I think there's 1.6 million being spent on the consultation over the diversity and inclusion new regulatory framework, which is being planned. There's been an exchange of letters with the Business Secretary over the last few weeks, and I understand you replied to her yesterday, so I just quickly had a look at your reply to her, and there seems to be a difference of opinion, because she suggested to you that the diversity and inclusion consultation paper that you put out was premised on expectations in the Equality Act and from the Public Sector Equality Duty specifically, and her point was, no, you don't need to be making the extent of proposals that you are in order to comply with the Equality Act and the PSED. From your reply, you're suggesting that indeed the rationale for the proposals is in your own regulatory remit from the Financial Markets Act or the Financial Services Act that set you up. But can I just get you to confirm, do you agree with her that you are not obliged under the Equality Act and the Public Sector Equality Duty to be making the proposals that you are in the consultation paper on firms' obligations to meet diversity and inclusion objectives?
Yeah, I'll need to check the figure that you quoted, and the Chair asked me about this near the start of the hearing. Now, these are proposals we are making. We're not obliged to make them, and it's a judgment as to whether they are consistent with our objectives. In the Treasury Committee's recommendations to us,
Yep.
Sectors in the City inquiry. As I understand it, this committee has said you believe it's a legitimate and important thing for regulators to be focused on. In particular, there was support for the work on non-financial misconduct, which is one half of the proposals, where we have seen some very serious and high-profile cases, and we do feel we need to take some action there to address that. And then you have made some comments around data collection, which we are taking very seriously alongside what the Minister has said and the 250 responses we have received. But you have said there are things you'd like us to do in terms of engaging with boards and senior leadership, equality impact assessments and the like. So we are thinking very hard about how to do that, to make sure we do it sensibly. And we think it does fit with our objectives, as does the PRA. This was joint work with the Bank of England, and we lay that out. We recognise that when we are acting in a manner that is potentially intersecting with social policy, a very thorough discussion with government and parliament is needed to make sure we stay relevant to our objectives, and we appreciate the focus this committee's given it.
Okay, great. Well, maybe I could ask Mr. Alder, because I appreciate your point you've made and you've replied to the Minister, but can I ask you, Chairman, Mr. Alder, how you see the diversity and inclusion agenda as set out in the consultation paper that the FCA has put out to be in accordance with the statutory objectives of consumer protection, integrity of the financial system, competition and the new secondary objective of growth? How do you see the diversity and inclusion agenda as being within those that remit?
Yeah, I think there is. I think the consultation paper itself went into elements which boil down to the way in which firms are able to organise themselves to perform more effectively, and part of that is having access to the widest pool of talent as is available. I think in relation to the sort of I think very heavy volume of responses to the consultation, we will be obviously looking at those responses and weighing them very carefully. There seems to be basically a differences of view, no particular difference of view about access to the widest pool of talent possible. The differences of views seem to boil down to how do you get there? And I think that's a genuine question. And I think that genuine question, when we get to the point of thinking about next steps, and as Nikhil has said, and it's been said previously, in the event we've kind of taken out the non-financial misconduct piece, and we'll be moving forward with that at pace. Okay. The other aspect, the remainder, which is basically around if firms to set targets, how do you report against them, whether there is a mandatory element to that, etc. I think we will need to assess, because, as I say, the goal or the overall objective, I think there's very little disagreement. It's how you do it.
Thank you. Well, can I just quickly, just lastly, ask Mr. Rathi to go into that point a little more. So as I understand it, the consultation paper suggests that you would expect the FCA to set appropriate diversity targets, but these wouldn't be sector-wide. Firms would be free to determine their own targets. Can you just help me understand what is meant by that precisely in terms of what it might mean for a firm? Would they have to have a target, but you wouldn't mandate what it was? What does it actually mean?
Yes, so this has obviously received a lot of feedback, and I think as this committee said in its report itself, a lot of firms are doing this already. Yeah. Of their own accord, and the link we made to competitiveness, and this is a strategic point. The example I gave when I gave evidence to the specific inquiry was we are the second largest investment management centre in the world. Only 12% of fund managers in the United Kingdom are women. That has barely moved, notwithstanding all the initiatives that have been put into that. And the question we were posing to the industry was, is this a sign of a healthy, competitive industry that is going to deliver best progress for all the talent? And the competitiveness of the City of London has relied on that skills and talent progressing over many, many decades and generations. So we were seeking to be very flexible about it, which is simply saying, look, that if you haven't got a target already, you should think about your data, look at what's going on, and make a judgment yourself about having one for that small number of firms that have not signed up to the Women in Finance Charter and done something, or signed up to any of the other initiatives. The actual content of that, the number, would be entirely for the firms to decide. And there's been some suggestion that we were going to impose quotas. We've been really clear publicly, and I've been very clear publicly, in the countries which have done quotas, it has been the legislature that has decided that. It wouldn't be for a regulator. It's, Norway and elsewhere where that's happened. It's been a political decision. So that's not what we're suggesting at all. The government's own Women in Finance Charter has set out evidence which they have published, which feels that target-led, data-led approaches can drive progress. And that was the basis on which we were moving forward.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. John.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I would just like to address in this part of the session the rebundling of research and MiFID II, if I may, before going on to the cost disclosure regime affecting investment trusts. And in doing so, once again, I refer the session and the committee to my interests as registered, as declared in the register. Kicking off with research and MiFID II, you'll be fully aware that as part of the government's Edinburgh reforms, it requested an independent review of the investment research market. The FCA is now considering recommendation 2 of the report because the report concluded that MiFID II unbundling requirements have had an adverse impact on the provision of investment research in the UK, and this has a potentially negative impact because in doing that, it's reduced to a certain extent the amount of investment research. This was their conclusion. You're now looking at this, and well done for that. Can I just ask, though, is reintroducing the bundling payment of research and executing services an acknowledgement that the regulations, or regulators I should say, were wrong to push for this as part of MiFID II in 2018?
So I think the debate about this when we were members of the European Union goes back sometime before 2018, and it was obviously a legislative decision at that time. And the evidence at that time, as I understand it, which was the basis of the legislation, was a severe concern around conflicts of interest in terms of the way research was being paid for, and there were some very high-profile cases where it appeared there were inappropriate conflicts of interest, in particular with trading commissions. I think we're now in a new environment. We are very open-minded about this consultation. We have laid it out last month to enable, with a certain degree of guardrails, trade execution to be bundled with research payments. It will be optional, not mandatory, because what we hear from firms is, for some firms, they're saying to us they won't change. They're quite happy with the system as it is. Other firms are saying they might like to take advantage of this, and it might also enable us to secure global consistency, particularly with those who operate in the United States. The guardrails are around making sure you're doing value assessments, you're benchmarking price properly, and you're disclosing properly as well, and there'll be flexibility for firms of all sizes. So I think we think this could help. We've had so far from our soft consultations, as it were, in terms of the roundtables we've done, we've had a generally positive reaction. I think the broader question of the supply of research is not just about this. It's about the move to passive. It's about the general attractiveness of equities and allocation to equities. It's about the growth in private equity. So part of the issue has been people just can't make enough money from providing these products, and that's one of the reasons why I think supply has constrained.
I was interested to hear you say that you do believe that by and large investors were getting the sort of research that was required, or certainly in a large number of cases. I mean, why then have you prioritised this policy reversal, or at least a review of the policy reversal? Because it seems a bit of a shift.
It is a shift, and Dr. Coffey asked me earlier about the Edinburgh reforms and our progress. And this is an example of us moving to deliver on what was agreed.
So basically you've done what you should have done, or should be doing, and that is assessing the marketplace, realising that the original regulations weren't perhaps up to scratch, and said, right, we're going to revisit this.
Absolutely, and I think we have an appropriate requirement now under the new legislation to keep all of our rules under review. We will do that with our insurance pricing rules later this year, with other rules, and if we feel that we need to change something, we then have a process to go through of consultation, cost-benefit analysis, engagement with this committee, which takes a bit of time to make those changes. And I think this is one example. And as I say, my sense is it's been fairly warmly welcomed by the industry so far. We'll see what comes in the consultation, the final responses. Okay.
Can I move us on briefly to the issue of the cost disclosure regime that is afflicting the investment trust sector at the moment? You will be fully aware that the importance of this sector to the economy. 40% of FTSE 250 companies are investment trusts. Many of them have been a conduit for tens of billions of pounds of investment into infrastructure, renewables, social care, and all this sort of stuff. But we seem to have a regulatory regime at the moment that is encouraging them, if not obliging them, to double count their costs so that they become unduly expensive. And this is resulting in investors not investing, and in fact selling, discounts widening, and investment into these important sectors drying up. Now, I'm not suggesting to you it's the only factor. I think there's a number of factors here, but it's definitely a key factor when these investment trusts look unduly expensive. It's also misleading to investors. Let me suggest a very simple solution. I mean, under the Investment Association's guidance, when it came to the UK's interpretation of MiFID II regulation, the guidance required companies to publish an aggregate cost figure in the European MiFID template feed, as you well know, which actually, and that figure should reflect costs that deducted or detracted from the value of the financial instrument. Given that investment trusts the value is determined by the share price, like other listed companies, unlike unit trusts, where those costs are deducted from the NAV, which is related to the price, why doesn't the FCA simply put out guidance to say that in future, the cost, the OCF charge, the ongoing charges, funds cost should be put in as zero, because that is what the share price is taking account of those costs, and therefore they shouldn't have to double count the cost by putting in a separate line with cost. Why doesn't the FCA do that?
So first of all, I'd agree with you, this is important to our capital market. We have 275 billion of assets under management in 359 funds. It's significant. It's a UK success story. You're quite right to point out the discount issue is complex, and I think in our exchanges at this committee, and now Baroness Bowles and the House of Lords Financial Services Regulation Committee, I think you've got a similar interest in this topic. In October, the discount was 16.5%. Today, the discount is 8.5%, is the latest data I have. So there are more things that affect the discount than this.
Yes.
And obviously, last 2 years, interest rates have moved up, which have changed the risk-reward calculus. So there are
we both agree that there are
market
other
impacts.
factors,
but
this is a key factor.
But on the specific point around disclosure, we accept that the current regime needs changing, and once we get the powers with respect to PRIPS, and the Treasury is looking at a statutory instrument around that, which of course they will need to present to Parliament, we stand ready to consult on a new regime. The reason we don't put it at zero today, and I wouldn't agree with you that it is zero, and I can explain why, but I agree that where we are now isn't right either, which is why we've allowed forbearance and disaggregation of costs. The reason we don't do it is because the legislation makes it very clear that this is what's required of us, and I don't think the Treasury disagrees with us on that point, and they're the guardians of the legislation, so we talk to them extensively about this. So we can't simply say something is zero when the law tells us that we have to require a disclosure. That law is now going to be changed in due course when the Treasury brings the instrument forward.
May I just question you on that very briefly, because the reading of MiFID II and this regulation is that costs should be declared, those costs that detract from the value of the financial instrument. Given the share price, and I'm just discussing this with you, as logically, looking above, all the regulations. Given the share price reflects those costs, like a share price in any other company, Marks and Spencer's or BP, it reflects the costs which are disclosed elsewhere in financial reports and so forth. Surely those costs should be reflected as zero in this EMT feed, which is so important to the industry.
The point I'd make...
Because it has a share price.
But at the same time, if you put £100 into an investment trust today, and it was an equity investment trust, and all the equities that composed that portfolio in that investment trust stayed at the same price, your value in a year's time would be lower because of the management fee that the investment trust manager charges. And these are products that are sold to retail investors, and that's why we think it is important that there is a degree of disclosure around what the management fees are, also to ensure a level playing field. But I would agree with you that the current system is not right. I also think if we removed it completely, and I know some people are pushing for this, I would wonder whether, and going back to Dame Angela's question earlier and others, whether actually the advisors and the wealth managers would feel comfortable recommending these products. And I would just always caution the industry to push really hard to remove any disclosure completely. It might actually be counterproductive because you might risk a degree of loss of confidence in the product
you
itself.
will be aware, Nikhil, you will be aware that 330 industry participants, including major fund management houses, actually wrote to the government about this and basically said that actually we need to reclassify so that these charges are not declared because they're already accounted for in the share price. So I'd push back a little bit on that with regard to yourself. But might I move us on? You're saying that essentially you're not going to move on this.
I'm not saying
it's down. Well, no. What I mean is, until you've had the government clearance on the
I don't think the
legislation.
government disagrees with our interpretation of legislation. We're in very close contact with the government on this, and it's that sort of.
And you're saying they agree with you on this?
I think ministers have been on record that they recognise that what we're doing is implementing the law as passed by Parliament in the statute, and we have taken forbearance measures. We can go further once the statutory instrument is laid by the minister, and we would obviously have to consult on the appropriate regime. And we are very open to all the feedback to get to a more sensible basis. But I don't think I'm hearing anything from the government suggesting that we're doing anything which is outside the statute.
Okay. Final question. Given that you think, or given that you believe that you need the legislative cover to change your position on this when it comes to guidance and the EMT feed. And by the way, as you're probably aware, no other European country follows this example of the MiFID II guidance when it comes to costs. They've all said that it's a nonsense. It's not been interpreted correctly.
Well, 12 out of 20, because obviously we're the lion's share in Europe. 12 out of 20 domiciled in the European Union have non-zero disclosures. So it's not the case that 60% of those in EU jurisdictions have some cost disclosure. Now, each country has, as is the case with European legislation, there's always a degree of interpretation, but it's not zero.
Let's be clear, we're talking about the EMT feed here.
Which is a voluntary feed.
There's a voluntary feed.
It's a voluntary feed.
And that's why I'm suggesting if you said guidance, you could put zero in, given costs are declared elsewhere. It would be a huge relief to the industry. But given your belief that the government needs to change the legislative position to enable you to provide the sufficient guidance and clarity on this, can I just ask, what is the FCA doing to push the government in its deliberations on this subject? Because it's been a little while now since the responses to the consultation has gone in. Can you give us a flavour as to the discussions you're having and how much pressure you're putting on the government to say, come on, we need to get moving on this?
I don't think it's appropriate for us to put pressure on the government about legislation. I think they're very apprised of the issues. They've received the letter. There are very intensive discussions going on, but those are obviously questions for the minister, the city minister.
Have you relayed the urgency of the situation?
We are obviously in intensive discussions with the Treasury because this will be coordinated. They have some judgments to make about the nature and form of legislation that they may wish to bring forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you, John. And we are expecting another set of votes, and at that point we will draw stumps and follow up with letters. But I do want to allow Stephen to ask a couple of questions before that happens.
Thank you. I'd like to come back very quickly on a couple of mortgage questions, if I may, particularly your assessment. When you were here in December, Mr. Rathi, you said I expect repossessions to be rarer than they were in previous periods of economic challenge in the UK. I wondered if you could just give us what the FCA's assessment or the FCA's research is at the moment of the number of mortgages with financial stress, and also what your assessment is of the pain that might still be to come through from delayed, renewals of mortgages.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond. One of the benefits of having a short break is my team told me something I should have said when in answer to your previous question. I think on enforcement you talked about disclosure of names of individuals. We are not changing our policy when it comes to individuals, so our policy proposal is around firms. Individuals, the presumption remains only in exceptional circumstances. So can I make that clear for the record, please? On mortgages, the quarterly figure for 2023 in terms of repossessions was 725. That's our latest data for 2023. Every quarter on average, 725 repossessions, which is obviously very distressing for those families and mortgage holders who are subject to repossession, but that remains significantly lower than many years before the pandemic. And we think that's because of the steps we have taken, and the industry has generally been very responsible in providing tailored support. There's the mortgage charter, and they really only are going to repossession as a last resort. There are 10.7 million regulated loan accounts, mortgage loan accounts in the United Kingdom. 1.3% of them are in arrears, or were in arrears at the end of 2023. That's the latest data we have. We'll publish more data when it is available. There are approximately 350,000 mortgage holders that are refinancing off a fixed rate every quarter. So, roughly speaking, you're talking about another 700,000 people this year, another 1.5 million people next year. Broad brush, they're coming off a rate of around 2%.
And
so
they're having to deal with a payment shock.
Absolutely. But the point I'd make about this cohort, that is, and it is painful for your constituents and others, the point I'd make about this cohort in 2025 that's coming up is they've had more time to plan their finances. So the cohort that went through this in 2022-23, it was very acute, it happened very quickly. If you're coming off your mortgage this time next year, you've had 2 or 3 years to think about what you do in terms of savings and other things to adjust. But that doesn't mean the stress is over. But so far, it feels like this is being managed as effectively as possible by the industry.
And presumably on the basis of your latter point, you would expect that stress, whilst there, to be lower again in terms of number of people where there are repossessions, and it could still remain low.
I'm always cautious about forecasting repossessions because some of the data is also affected by what's been going on in the court system, and there was a backlog from COVID, so some of that is coming through. So I would expect repossessions may rise, but I don't think you're going to see anything like what we saw in the 1990s or in 2008 or 9.
And I noted your comment that lenders and banks were acting responsibly. How much of that is due, do you think, to the mortgage charter being in place?
So our rules on forbearance and tailored support predate the mortgage charter. We introduced emergency rules during the pandemic, and then we are making them permanent now. So we're consulting in April, and they'll become effective in November 2024. With respect to the mortgage charters, between June 23 and February 24, we have seen 98,500 move to interest only, and 37,700 take a term extension. So it's about 130,000 mortgage holders have taken advantage of it. So that's been an important flexibility for those people. The point I would always make about the mortgage charter and these flexibilities, we always say consumers should only take them if they really can't afford to pay their mortgage, because any of these flexibilities mean that over the lifetime of the mortgage,
Sure.
you'll be paying more interest. And that is typically not the best thing.
No, of course not.
For households.
It may well be a solution to a
For the short
repossession.
term,
Yeah.
to help bridge, but only if you really need it.
Okay, is that all?
Well, there might be others, but I
think we're about to
bet
break.
we're
But,
about.
just on a year ago, you were forecasting that by next month, the number of households with financial stretch may increase to 356,000. Do you have an updated number on that?
We don't have an updated forecast, but the economic conditions are much better.
Okay.
And unemployment has not risen as much as one might have feared. Wage growth has been stronger, and therefore the situation has eased. But that doesn't mean there isn't still stress in the system.
Okay. We do have a lot of other questions, but I think this is the appropriate moment to call time on this session, and we will follow up with our further questions by letter, if that's all right with you. Order.
Thank you, Chair.
Has ended.